I am veterinarian Brian Gregor, and you are listening to the Vetpodcast. The Vetpodcast, I think, has come to a crossroads, but before I get to that, I thought we should take a wee walk down memory lane. The Vetpodcast, as some of you may know, has been around for a while. The first podcast was actually recorded 18 years ago. Yes, you heard that right. Before podcasting was even really a thing. I recorded my first podcast in 2006. The thought at the time was to use it to give information to the clients of my practice. As I don't throw anything away, here are some excerpts from that very first podcast. It was really low budget. I even played, if you could call it played, the introduction myself. Welcome to another podcast from the Highfield Veterinary Centre in Timaru, New Zealand. I am Brian Gregor, and I will endeavour to demystify and explain topics of veterinary interest. Hi, and welcome to the first podcast of the Highfield Veterinary Centre. See what I mean? To be fair, I don't think my guitar playing has got any better in the 18 years. The topic that I discussed in this first podcast was really simple. It was actually just vaccination recommendations for cats and dogs. As I said, this was originally started just as another means of communication to the clients from the Highfield Veterinary Centre. What I want to discuss today, just very briefly, are vaccination recommendations for cats and dogs. And so it went on. I don't think that the recording quality got much better for a while. I think my voice got a little bit better. I got a little bit more relaxed. I don't know. What do you think? Skinny, hungry, and anxious. This sounds like a description of the latest crop of models strutting their stuff on the catwalk who are strung out on V. But no, what I'm talking about is probably the most common hormone disease that we see in cats over 8 years old. It's the disease which is known as hyperthyroidism. So over the next year or so, things rolled on quite nicely. I think the recording got a bit better. I renamed the podcast. It went from being the Highfield Veterinary Centre podcast to, of all things, Animals Get Sick Too. And it had a byline in there of Vetpodcast or the Vetpodcast. The other thing that changed was advertising. Very early on, I actually got buy-in by a couple of drug companies. So I was probably one of the first podcasts that was carrying advertising.
Has my dog got what? Worms? Absolutely not.
Keep your pets healthy. Trust Drontal.
So just bear in mind that we are talking at the moment about the late 2000s, 2006, 7, 8, 9. At the time, internet technology was rudimentary, to say the least. One of the biggest issues was recording. I was using a program called Audacity, which is still going now. And to be fair, I'm actually recording still now. This is being recorded on Audacity. But what did change was the ability to use the internet to connect with people around the world. This is pre-Zoom days, but there was a workaround. There was Skype, which I think is still around now, and I purchased a plugin that meant that I could actually record online conversation with people. This was an absolute game changer.
I'd like to introduce Fiona MacDonald, who is, am I right, you're the Secretary of the United Kingdom Fish Vet Society?
That's correct, yes.
This setup opened the world to me. I now had access to animal health people, veterinarians, researchers from throughout the world. And to be fair, most people I approached were only too happy to discuss things with me. The issue I had, though, is, again, remember, we're back in the 2000s. Dial-up modem, maximum speed, 2 megabit per second, and we're in the country, and it's weather dependent, and, wow, it didn't always go as planned. In the TV series, James Herriot drove around in a little Austin 7, which, to be truthful, so did my father. Was that the type of car that your father actually drove in practice, or is that just a bit of literary license?
No, he did. He did drive an Austin 7. This incredible car as well, people think it was exaggerating. But this car had...
This was one of these situations where I could have just sat down and cried. Did you pick up at the start of the interview who I was actually talking to? It was a UK veterinarian called Jim White. Now, Jim White is the son of another veterinarian called Arthur White. Now, Arthur White is the nom de plume of none other than James Herriot. If you have had any fleeting interest in veterinary science, I'm sure you know who James Herriot is. There was so much interesting stuff that we talked about. Unfortunately, half of it was lost in just a garble and it never made it to the final podcast. So from this point, the Vetpodcast seemed to be going from strength to strength. The listeners were picking up nicely. There were a few obstacles and hiccups in the way. The first was my original host, who moved on to better things and stopped hosting podcasts. This was back in the early days of the internet, and there was no ability to redirect the feed. So I ended up losing so many of my listeners, so had to start again. The next thing that happened was that Skype, who I had been recording from, stopped accepting second-party programs attached to it. So I had to find a new way to record the podcast. None of these were insurmountable, though, and life went on. The other huge obstacle that came in the way was COVID. Now, like everybody else, I think, once in lockdown, what do? You learn how to make sourdough bread. I also decided I was going to pick up my guitars again and try and learn to play the guitar again. Well, that didn't last very long. I have to say that my sourdough bread was really good though. But what this did do was everybody was in the same boat as me, particularly in New Zealand. Lockdown, couldn't go outside. What else do? It's just the ideal opportunity to sit down and make podcasts. So two things. One, I had a captive audience to listen. I had a captive audience to talk to. And COVID supplied a number of different topics that I could discuss. How a veterinary practice is dealing with COVID. Can animals get COVID? Can animals give COVID to humans? Even talking to zoo veterinarians. So there we go. There is always a silver lining. Over the years, we have had a really diverse range of guests on the Vet Podcast. A few years ago, I think it was actually post-COVID, I brought a number of these together into one of the episodes of the podcast. So these are just some of the off-the-wall comments that were made by some of the guests. So this is the recording that I did way back. One of our most popular guests was Jess, a veterinary nurse and veterinary nutritionist from Melbourne in Australia, who many of you, especially the Instagrammers, may already know as Nutrition RVN. Jeff gave us no-nonsense information on pet nutrition and also the microbiome. And amongst this information were a few absolutely brilliant one-liners that those of us in practice would completely endorse. I asked her who people should go to for nutritional advice for their pets.
Of course, always ask your vet for advice and your vet team. They're always going to be able to give you the best advice available to them at the time. They're also going to give you evidence-based advice, not, what Susan said on Facebook.
So, sorry, Susan, I think we'll leave our questions to somebody who actually knows the answer rather than some random on Facebook. The next quote that Jess makes has got to be one of the best ones that we've had all year. It just resonates so much with me.
Nutrition's not an opinion, it's a science. So I think it's just important that we look at the source where those opinions are coming from.
Nutrition is not an opinion, it's a science. That is just brilliant. And I'm sure that we can actually apply that exact same comment to veterinary science. Veterinary science is not an opinion, it is a science. Now, sometimes when veterinary science isn't a science, became quite obvious when I was talking to Jim White. Now, Jim White is the son of Arthur White, and Arthur White had an alter ego. He's the guy that wrote the James Herriot books that many of you will know. A year or two ago, I had a really good yarn to Jim about old-time vetting.
An old vet told my father when he was a student in Glasgow, he said, if you want to be a success in veterinary practice, just keep the bowels open and trust the rest to God.
This is back in the days of purges and emetics, but sometimes the treatment went the other way and was a little bit more, shall we say, obstructive.
I remember he used to tell me that with horses with colic, they used to stuff raw onions up the rectum of horses with colic, this sort of thing. My dad used to like these cases because he used to take the onions out. He used to cure them by taking the onions out. But then suddenly, of course, the way it's changed, he suddenly had the modern drugs. And then overnight almost, the vet became the magician with the needle. There were great days for the vet there, the magic man with the needle. These days have gone.
So these old treatments that they're using, the onions and the mustard poultices, did they work?
I think some of them used to work. There always was a little bit of truth in some of these old, and logic in some of these old witchcraft treatments. I mean, if you look at the world of James Herriot at some of the stands in the old pharmacy, some of the stuff they used to drench down calves with husk parasitic bronchitis, mixtures with ether and turpentine and arsenic and all these things. I mean, half of them used to kill the patient, let alone the worms. Some of them used to work, especially the castor oil. I don't know what it's like in New Zealand, but the old-fashioned farmers here, a stoppage was the worst thing an animal could have. They used to call castor oil opening medicine.
These pearls of wisdom just aren't confined to James Herriot either. I remember when I was a young and impressionable vet, an old practitioner came up to me and he said to me, Brian, he said, the one thing that you must remember in veterinary practice is that the world's best veterinarian is Mother Nature. Just leave the bloody thing alone. Let's keep moving. While doing these interviews, I have come across some absolute characters, and probably without a doubt at the top of a list is our old friend George Sophronides. George is one of the bosses of Orivet, which is an Australian genetic company, and he just came out with the most amazing statements. We've been talking mainly about dogs. You do these similar tests for cats?
Oh, cats, don't get me started, Brian. If you thought dog people were challenging, cat people, seances and burning candles and incense going.
So apologies to our cat lovers who are listening to this. We really don't think that you're crazy, cat ladies. We really do love you. George also jumped into the realms of, I don't know, it almost sounded like something that Dr. Seuss would have written.
You might be at a park and you might be walking your cavoodle and someone might say, oh, what's that? That looks like a schnoodle. And all of a sudden you'll start thinking, schnoodle? I thought it was a cavoodle. I'm going to do my DNA test to verify.
Sometimes during the production process, I have had to get quite creative, I suppose is the word, with the editing of some of the recordings. An example here is of an interview that I did with Benjamin Kennedy, who is an exotic veterinarian working in the UK. We'll hear more from him soon. I asked the question of Benjamin, what makes a good pet? And he was bestowing the virtues of a mantis as a pet. So here's the two cuts. The first excerpt here is as you heard it. This is as it was after editing in the podcast. But the next one is as it was actually recorded.
A mantis, for instance, is a wonderful pet, easily the equivalent of a hamster, truthfully.
And so here is what was actually recorded.
A mantis, for instance, is a wonderful pet, easily the equivalent of a hamster, truthfully. By the way, I live next to a station. So did you hear that?
Yeah, I did hear that, yeah.
Give me a moment.
And it's not just trains which cause issues with the recording process. Here is Lindsay Thomas, who is another UK-based veterinarian. Lindsay deals with fish, and I was asking her about the type of conditions which can be treated and which fish can get. As she's answering, let's welcome Sky the cat. I've done the same thing again. The first cut is as you would have heard it, as it was edited, and the second cut is as it was actually recorded. The kind of conditions that you are looking for and treating in the animals are the same, again, as we would see in your standard companion animals, your farm animals, humans, tumours, lacerations, infections, parasites.
The main things clients are going to present for are things like skin infections, fin infections, possibly tumours, lacerations and things.
And this is how it started. Tumours, lacerations, infections, parasites. They're your major kind of things that you're looking for.
Sorry, one sec. I'll start that again while the cat has a slight... Sky, shush! Sorry, she's gone up into the loft now. It should be okay. I don't know what's got into her.
That's all right, because I've got a possum up on the roof at the moment too, banging and crashing. So. Welcome to the Antipodes. Let's go back to Benjamin Kennedy, the exotic vet from the UK. I asked Benjamin what I thought was a fairly straightforward clinical question. How do you tell if your pet insect is sick? Now, I was expecting an answer that came back along the lines of stops eating, lays on its back, changes colour. I don't know what a sick insect looks like. The answer that I got was more to do with marital relationships than veterinary medicine.
To quote the great Mary Branca, who is one of the first female presidents of the BVA, she founded the Veterinary Invertebrate Society. And when she would be asked this question, and her response would be, "How would you know your wife is sick?" To which her response is, "You would look at her, and you know, because you should know your wife." And I think the same thing is true. I think invertebrates that are sick look sick.
We'll just stick with Benjamin here for a minute. You heard in that earlier clip with the train about Benjamin's love for mantises as pets. It just doesn't stop at mantises. Here's what he says about snakes.
I think many snakes probably see their owners as mouse dispensers, but I think even snakes can get very used to you and handling you and can give you support and interact with you.
But wait, there's more. I asked Benjamin in the Avian podcast whether the personalities of, in particular, parrots were actually personalities, or whether they were like parrots did with a lot of other things. They were mimicking a personality.
I think they're actually personable. I would say, to be controversial, they're more personable in some ways than dogs and cats are, because I think overall, I would say parrots are cleverer and they're more involved than dogs and cats. I think a parrot really has a very sophisticated brain and it's able to deal with a lot of information. And I think you often hear it said that a parrot's the equivalent of a 3 to 5 year old.
And just to finish off, let's just keep going with our love theme here. I was talking to Annette McFadgen, who is a veterinary tech or a veterinary nurse working in a practice in the north of the South Island of New Zealand, and they run an HBOT machine, a hyperbaric oxygen treatment machine. And I asked her again what I thought was a clinical question, just to describe the machine to me. And this is her lyrical answer.
Well, I think it's quite beautiful. It looks aesthetically pleasing. It's a big white spaceshipy looking thing with a control panel at one end and kind of like portholes, 3 of those around, so you can watch what's going on with your patient and they can look back at you.
So now we reach the crux of what this podcast is actually about. You'll remember that earlier on I mentioned that it's a Crossroads kind of a podcast. For the regular listeners of the Vet Podcast, I'm sure you're aware that the podcasts have become a little bit intermittent, a little bit few and far between. We have been travelling a lot, so it it got to be quite difficult when we were overseas in countries with poor internet connection, or, to be fair, better things to do. I've been retired for over 5 years now, so I'm out of the face-to-face veterinary scene. What I have done over the last year or so is posted a few podcasts which run in with my TikTok, Instagram and Facebook accounts on what I've termed better work stories. It's just funny stuff that's happened to me through my years. A little bit James Herriot-y. I'll actually, just to remind you, or if you haven't heard them, I'll put a couple of them up now. This is one of these situations where you really have to wonder what the client was thinking. It was a busy afternoon and I got a phone call from my receptionist, and she said that Mr. Smith's on the phone and he would like to talk to you about his blood results. So I said, yep, that's fine. Flicked through my files and found a file there for a cat belonging to Mr. Smith. Now, these cat results, blood results, didn't look particularly good. They indicated end-stage kidney failure. The cat was stuffed, not too much to do. So, picked up the phone and Mr. Smith, how are you? Got through the normal pleasantries. He says, right, tell me about the blood results. So I said, look, and went through them. The kidneys aren't that flash, and went through all of the parameters and anemia and all this sort of thing. And he was, okay, so what do we do about that? I put on my best bedside manner and said, look, I think probably the best thing that we can consider would have to be euthanasia. I think it's just the kindest. It's going to stop any suffering, which is, if not happening already, will be happening soon. There was a stunned silence on the phone. Nothing. It was just dead. About 10 seconds, 15 seconds later, he came back to me and he said, can you do that? And I said, do what, Mr. Smith? And he said, euthanasia. And I said, yeah, of course, euthanasia is not a problem at all. We can do it whenever you want, actually. And my advice would be sooner rather than later. Again, a stunned silence. And I said, well, do you want to book that in, or do you just need to have a think about it or have a talk to the family? And he said, oh, look, I would actually really, really like to talk to my family about this. This is a huge step. Two things. One, I didn't know you could do that. And two, I wasn't expecting these results from the blood tests. All I did was called into the doctor for my regular 6-monthly blood tests. And I said to him, hang on a minute, what do you mean called into the doctor for your 6-month blood tests? And he says that, well, I called into the Highfield Medical Centre to get my blood test taken. Then the penny dropped. We are the Highfield Veterinary Centre, and just by coincidence, we had run some blood screens on a cat belonging to a Mr. Smith, and this poor old bugger thought that I was suggesting that he be euthanized. Better work stories, everybody. And this next story, although it was really frustrating, you have to admire the guy for his inventiveness. A long time ago, a very long time ago, I was working in a small rural area in the Taranaki, which is an area in the North Island of New Zealand. I was on duty. It was a Saturday night. From memory, it must have been the springtime. And it was about 6:30 at night, sun just going down. And I got a phone call from a client that we didn't do a lot of work for. He lived up the mountain, Mount Taranaki, Mount Egmont, on the border of the national park. So it was relatively remote. It was probably about a half-hour drive to get up there. So I got this phone call and he said to me that he had a cow down. Now, a cow down is, normally it's a metabolic problem. It's something like low magnesium, low calcium. They may be sick, can be life-threatening. So, right, I'll come up now and check what's going on. So I got out of the house into the cold, drove up the mountain. Half an hour later, I arrived there, drove to the cattle yard, which is the normal thing you do. No one there. Tooted on the horn. No one came. I thought, oh, bugger it. Drove back down to the house. Now, one thing that I did forget to mention is that this guy was an older-ish bachelor. Drove down to the house, knocked on the door, and he opened the door. He was in his city clothes. He was in his finery. He was looking sharp, and he smelt like a bottle of Old Spice. So I said to him, well, here I am. Where's the cow that's down? Funny story, he said. She got up and she ran away. I thought, oh, well, that's a waste of an hour. Half an hour up, half an hour back. Then he said to me, you're going back to town now? You got another call? And I said, no, I'm going straight back to town now. And he says, I'll grab a lift with you. Can I get a lift with you back to town? So, I mean, what do? I couldn't really say no because I was going back to town. So he hopped in the car with me. As I was heading back down the road, I turned to him and I said, look, I'm still going to have to charge you the visit for coming up here, even though I didn't see the cow. That's not a problem, he said. It actually costs less for your visit than for me to get a taxi up from town. You have to ask, was the cow ever down? So I think coming to the end of this podcast, let's get to the crux of what I'm actually trying to say and do here. I'm at a crossroads, as I said earlier. What do I do with the Vet Podcast? It's been 18 years. I've really, really enjoyed it, discussing veterinary matters with colleagues from around the world. And hopefully people have taken stuff out of it. But what I have been doing recently, and what I have really enjoyed doing recently, are these better work stories. If you haven't heard them, a lot of them are actually on TikTok and the other social media platforms, but in the short term, I put most of them on TikTok. On all of the social network platforms, just search Vet Podcast and you will find me. But what I would like to do, I think, is to continue on with the better work stories. Now, this is where you guys come in, the veterinary professionals amongst you. I'm sure that I'm not the only person that funny stuff has happened to. If that is you, let me know. Contact me. Email me, vetpodcast@gmail.com, or just chase me up on any of the social networks. Just message me. And I would love to talk to you, if possible, record you. And we can put these into ongoing podcasts, my Better Work Stories podcast, if you like. So hopefully I will be talking to some of you soon.